Open to Buy is a budget allocation tool which is commonly used in the fashion industry. Today we're going to understand exactly why it's so popular and discuss whether modern technology can provide an alternative approach which can cater for the fast fashion generation. So Janice, how does Open to Buy actually work?
So Open to Buy is basically a very simple process. That exists under many flavors. It's not something like completely monolithic, I would say, in terms of way it's done. It's a very simple, I would say, inventory allocation process that is an alternative to just, I would say, min-max. So if you go for very, very basic inventory allocation methods, you have min-max. You have a min, you have a max, and basically once your stock goes down to a certain level, you just replenish to the max. And that works for pretty much all the companies. It's very crude and it's not super efficient, but it kind of works, although crudely, for all the companies that are selling the same products for a long period of time. Because basically with min-max, you're just assuming that you will do repeat business over and over with the same products. As soon as you go into, let's say, fashion, you end up with a very blunt problem, which is your products rotate. So if you just adopt something as basic as min-max, which is probably about the simplest inventory allocation method that you can have, you face a problem is that you start to replenish something that is supposed to go away, so it doesn't work. So actually, the idea of Open to Buy is to kind of slightly shift this very, very simple min-max perspective that you had at the product level. You're just going to displace the very same idea at, I would say, category level or something. So suddenly, instead of looking at one product, you say, okay, I'm looking at, let's say, pants. There will be like new pants that comes into my assortment all the time. They are like old pants that I'm phasing out. Obviously, all of that is typically driven by collections when we are in fashion, but basically you have products that comes in, products that comes out. And Open to Buy is a simple, I would say, idea that you're going to drive with some kind of, I would say, constraints, some kind of min-max constraints at a more granular level, some kind of category.
Okay, you mentioned there sort of the fashion industry. Are there any other industries that sort of use the Open to Buy methodology as well?
I believe it's very much the fashion industry. There is probably a few other industries that are very driven by novelty that also use that, but in my experience, that's literally, the vast majority. I think I've seen that a couple of times right and left, but mostly it was because the person that was in charge of the supply chain had an experience in the fashion, so they just recycled their recipes, potentially doing something that was actually fairly different from I would say, the canonical Open to Buy. And the canonical Open to Buy typically take it from a more financial perspective. The min-max is really in terms of inventory, is really in terms of number of units. Typically, Open to Buy is more something that is expressed in dollars or euros, where you say, okay, I have this category, I've already committed this amount of dollars because that's the stock that I already have, and I'm willing to extend myself up to this, so I'm open to buy this amount of extra dollars to reach my budget target. And obviously, people usually add some kind of I would say quarterly slots. Sometimes it's slot per quarter, per semester. Sometimes it's only per year. A lot of companies are dreaming to go toward monthly slots, but usually they don't achieve that. They remain kind of stuck with quarterly budgets.
Yeah, and it's certainly something that's kind of exceedingly popular with the fashion companies that we kind of talk to. So why is it something that is so commonplace?
Again, the basic thing is that you start with min-max. Whenever you have long-lived products, and if you want to graduate, and the problem is that min-max don't even work for fashion. So they did the kind of the simplest thing that was actually making any sense for fashion, which was to kind of do min-max, but at a more granular level, and then you end up with Open to Buy. And And if you look at, the amount of mathematics or, papers that you will find on open to buy in the literature, there is almost none. Because actually, once you've said that open to buy is basically having the top management that is just going to decide of budgets, categories by categories, split that quarter by quarter, sometimes month by month, but usually it remains at the quarter level. And how do you end up with those budgets? Well, you just look at what you've done last year and you nudge the number a little bit up or down based on mostly gut feelings. Why not? It's not insane. But once you've said that, and then the supply chain practitioners that is supposed to, turn this budget into actual purchase orders or manufacturing orders, how do they do that? Well, they look at the novelty and then they just, have some kind of gut feeling. And so it's very, I would say, it's very empirical. It's very subjective. Subjective means it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. It just means that the quality purely depends on the person doing it, manually. So if you have like a great supply chain practitioners that is super good at filling the market, maybe this person is going to have like tremendous results. If you have somebody who is maybe not as experienced, maybe not as interested in their job in the first place, then you're going to have like results that are nowhere as good. But in any case, the fact that you've put some kind of macro constraints on the budgets mean that you can't really get things that are really, really insane, because you've put the open to buy puts constraints on the budget on all the categories, so there is limits on the size of the mistakes that you can make.
Okay, so then from a forecasting perspective, basically those little bumps that you're adding to a budget, that's how you're kind of forecasting what you're expecting future demand to likely be.
But the thing is that open to buy, there is no real forecast per se. You don't, obviously you decide your budget, but you don't really forecast that. And the strange thing with fashion is that, you typically with open to buy, you're thinking in terms of allocating, a purchasing budget. And the thing is, so you're not even allocating, things for a certain volume of sales. You're allocating for a volume of purchase. And guess what? If you say you can purchase $1 million worth of pants, well, that's pretty much what you're going to purchase. So it's completely self-fulfilling prophecy. And then are you going to sell those pants afterward? And the answer is yes, potentially with a massive discount. But you will sell them. So you see, there is no forecast really involved, and then you have self-fulfilling prophetic effects that are very strong. So that basically what you decide comes to pass anyway.
Okay, and how do you sort of decide what the different categories are? I mean, how are you actually implementing this?
So the categorization is the easy part, and typically I think it's subjective, but also it's very reasonable. Just because typically it's type of products. So brands, especially fashion brands, they have, I would say, a very clear picture of what is their assortment. How do you classify those products in terms of it's a very established practices to know if you can if you should consider that knee-high boots are just like any other boots or it's a different category. I mean, I believe this sort of things, it's partly arbitrary, but this is the split is usually kind of reasonable. This is not the problem. The problem is that although the categorization itself is kind of fine, the problem is that you then leverage this categorization to drive tons of arbitrary budget decisions that are very rigid and that might that are not necessarily aligned with the need of the business. It's not the category itself that is, the category is just what it is. It's a type of products. You can decide to sell it or not. But it's a budget that you have on top of that is subject to that you should question, I would say.
Okay, so I guess on the surface of it, kind of the key advantage to it is it's very kind of simplistic. I mean, because you're just taking a category that you already know, you're applying a budget, which is based on last year. You can kind of do that from gut feel. So is it fairly kind of simple to implement them?
I mean, it is, I would say it is easy to implement. It's not simple. And that's a trick. Easy because it's a kind of simplistic idea, so it's not, there is nothing fundamentally challenging. Is it simple? Well, in my experience, it's very far from being simple. Because the problem is, because it's very manual, you need, I would say, a fairly complex organization to make it fly. First, you will need to have like those budgets done at the very top level, such as, for example, men garments versus women garments versus children garment. You will have tons of you will have a very top-down process to do all those budget decisions. So basically, you will have like one layer of management that is going to take, the first 100 decisions, but that's not going to give you the complete granularity that you need. So you will have like a second layer of management that will, cut it down to the smaller budget then. And then you will have the time aspect with seasonality, where you will need to transform those budget decisions into buckets per quarter, ideally per month. But where I say ideally, I'm not saying that it's better. I'm saying that most companies see that going from quarterly to monthly, as far as their budget is concerned, as better. I disagree, but just because, again, you opt here, it looks like better, but remember, your budgets that you decide are only constraints on what you do. So having, tighter constraints just limit the downside, so it prevents very, very big mistakes from being made, yes, but so that's the upside, but the downside is that it also frequently prevent your own teams to actually do the right thing when there is something that is really surging, where it's kind of obvious that there is like strong demand on the market on that, and you have the monthly budget that puts a lot of constraints around what you do, then basically you're kind of stuck. So that's why I say going from in terms of data analysis, going from yearly to quarterly to monthly to weekly or even daily is better, because you have like a finer grained perception of the data. So it's nearly always better. But if you think in terms of something that is like open to buy, not necessarily, because those are constraints. So back to this kind of easy versus simple, you will have a lot of people involved. And because it's very subjective, you will end up with tons and tons of discussion. And so it's very time consuming. And because it's very subjective, you don't have any way to really, sort it out of who is right, who is wrong. So that creates a lot of, I would say, second order anti-patterns, like that establish, a culture in the company of fairly arbitrary decisions. The management might be right, the management might be wrong, but because, all of that is very arbitrary, it gives, in the company a culture that, whatever the management says goes, and that's a problem. You want the management to be really challenged on the right stuff, not have like your pyramid style management where things fall from the top and are assumed to be correct. I mean, even if they are, management is not complete, people at the top are usually more competent than the people at the bottom. On average, there might be exception for dysfunctional company, but still the problem is that when you have this sort of culture, I see that it's a problem even for the management to get better. If when you take a decision has to be made, but you have no way to really know if it's good or bad. It's super hard, even as a middle manager. Somebody, especially for people that are like in the middle, they don't take the big top strategic decision. They don't take the final decision with the exact quantities that you're going to buy. So you take, for example, when I see this sort of situation, the middle manager that is just going to take like a decision about an intermediate budget, I mean, it's very, very hard if you know what you're doing is just make any sense, actually.
Yeah. So these constraints seem like a fairly kind of crude approach of taking. So perhaps what would be a better way in introducing kind of a better level of granularity?
So first, the idea is that, okay, why are we doing that? The key idea is that all the, I would say, the classic time series, I would say classic supply chain models, optimization models, were geared around the notion of time series. And by the way, that's how you can, in the literature, optimize something like min-max or safety stocks, all of those things that assume, a certain amount of stationarity in your business, or not, ongoing stream of novelty. They're geared around the notion of time series, and which is also a very simplistic mathematical model. And in case of fashion, it just do not work because a lot of products do not have any history. So the question is, I mean, the first step, if you want to do better, you just need mathematical tools, data analytic, statistical tools that let you operate in a situation where most products don't have histories. I mean, the products of interest in the sense of taking decisions, it doesn't mean that you don't have any history. You have all your previous collections. It's a lot of very valuable data that is readily available. So, so the way we at Lokad we approach that, we say, well, we don't need to have sales history on the new products. We can just leverage all the attributes that we have on the products. The shape, the color, the price point, the materials, the style. I mean, you have typically, if you have like a novelty-driven businesses, usually for most of your products, you have a lot of things that you know. And I'm not talking necessarily about having like a photograph, but just having characteristics. Usually those products are very well characterized. Thus, you can use that to do a forecast. Obviously, your forecast is going to be very inaccurate, so you need to have like a probabilistic forecast. Otherwise, it's going to be deceptive. But based on that, suddenly, if you have some kind of appropriate forecasting toolkits, then you can go back to something that is much more simple, where every time you have a new product, you can do a forecast. It's not a forecast in isolation because you have cannibalization and substitution. So whenever you decide that you're going to add a product in your assortment, it's going to slightly cannibalize plenty of other products, and thus start making decisions with that. But you see, the interesting thing is that suddenly we are taking marginal decisions. So we have one more product that is of interest. Designers came up with a new design. It's interesting. It has a series of characteristics. We could say, okay, what if we just add this product to the assortment? And what is the reasonable, purchasing decision or manufacturing decision to be associated with this product? And that's a decision that you can take, one product at a time. When I say one product at a time, I don't mean in isolation. So you look at one product, it has cannibalization effect, so you need to take that into account, and you can decide yes or no, am I going to order more? And if yes, okay, these products enter your assortment with an initial order quantity. And then you can repeat that, with other products. So in a way, it's much more simple because suddenly, you don't need 3 layers of hierarchy to decide. It's much more streamlined. You have a new design, you can quantitatively assess what's the outcome if you add this design in your assortment and in your channels, and you decide if you do anything, and then rinse and repeat.
Yeah, and you mentioned there kind of fashion companies are very hierarchical. So would they have to change the way they fundamentally operate to allow for a solution like that to work?
Absolutely. But in exchange, it's actually much more simple. That the thing is that all those, I mean, fashion companies, they want to be relatively, reactive with respect of the latest trends. But all the problem with open to buy is that nearly all the processes that I've seen in this area are very geared toward waterfalls. So you end up with a first stage where it's going to be range planning, and then some other thing about planning, and then it's going to be purchasing, and then etc. So you end up with, I mean, it goes with various names, but typically you end up with a waterfall project, a waterfall process, with 3 or maybe sometimes, half a dozen of steps. And that's how you can end up with literally 6 months or even worse, more of lead times, end to end from the new designs that are being considered to the product being, I would say, sold in the channels available to the brand. So overall, it's very slow. Although it looks easy, in the end you end up with a process that is kind of slow. And so yes, that's a lot of changement, but mostly it's good changes. It's things that are just simpler, more direct, and where you just realize that you have like layers of processes that are just not needed anymore.
Yeah, and the fashion industry was one that was particularly hit by sort of the coronavirus epidemic recently. We're seeing sort of retailers slashing their prices at present to try and come back from that. So do you think that will cause the industry to kind of reevaluate where they're currently at and be open to kind of new ideas, or do you think it's one that's fairly kind of set in its ways?
As a rule of thumb, I consider that the market is not a great educator. It's a filter. So actually, my experience in business is, I mean, you might say it's a bit pessimistic, but basically, people just never learn. I would say it's not the way it works. I'm joking. I mean, individually, people learn. For organization to learn, it's very difficult. And what I see is that usually organization they just don't learn. What happens is that if you have like a very dysfunctional process, it will just remain until some competitor who do not have a dysfunctional process just kicks you out of the market altogether. So it's and you might, I mean, and that, so obviously it's not always the case, there is to some degree you can improve, etc. So my hope is that some businesses, will challenge themselves successfully and obviously adopt those better practices. But I would say my intuition is that a crisis is not going to, suddenly make people more educated or push people to get more educated. It just means that a lot of businesses will unfortunately go bankrupt, and the one that survives will be the one that are more willing to adopt, better stuff. And it's the way I see that. And you could have even example, due to the crisis, for example, Walmart just decided to shut down Jet.com. So Jet was, an e-commerce that was growing fast, even managing to compete against Amazon. And so they had and basically succeeding in growing against a giant like Amazon is very, very difficult. And basically they got acquired in a company that didn't have this culture, and in the end, well, they failed after acquisition. So you see that, for me, that's an illustration that and basically Walmart has been failing at competing against Amazon online for a decade. And even when they acquire, they end up basically injecting their own culture, and so they don't really manage to fix that. So that's why I say open to buy. I believe that the companies that will 10 years from now that will come very strongly will be the one that will have challenged the most those sort of things. But again, that's just survival bias. I believe that the market will just act as a filter. And actually, the very good fashion companies, some of them have already started to, I would say, to diverge quite significantly from, I would say, the classical open to buy process that I've just described.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave it there, but thanks for your time. So that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Bye for now.